So this is our third and last panel of the day, moderated by Dr. Patrick Keller, Vice President of the BAX. And this panel is about the future of the alliance. Where are we going? Thank you very much, Ms. Weigel. I have a bit of a sore throat. I hope it's not COVID. It's not. I've been tested. I hope you can still hear me. So welcome to this last panel of today's NATO Talk 2020. We would like to talk about where NATO is going. We started the day by talking about what keeps NATO united and what are the challenges to cohesion, what are the challenges the member states are confronted with. And now to conclude, we would like to look towards the future and see what does the alliance have to do to set it up for the future. The election of Joe Biden in the US has been received with much relief in Europe. We are hearing that this is an opportunity, maybe the last opportunity to actually revive the transatlantic relations. So what we would like to discuss today is how exactly can that be achieved? What is the ambition that we need to promote NATO? I think we Europeans have seen during these 4 years of Trump that NATO is also our NATO. It is certainly not the time to just lean back and say, Joe's going to solve the issues, back to the good old days. No, quite the contrary. There's so many challenges and crises. We mentioned China. There's the COVID crisis, that's not only an issue for us in the West. The threat of Russia is still very present, and there's so many other crises. So I am pleased that we will be discussing NATO's agenda for the future with 4 excellent, renowned experts. To my right, there is Dr. Tobias Lindner, security policy spokesperson of the Green Party and member of the German Parliament. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that he is one of the experts on German security and defense policy in Germany. Then to my left, Dr. Jana Puglierin. She leads the European Council on Foreign Relations, or its office in Berlin, and she's a senior fellow there. And she is certainly one of the experts in the German strategic community in Berlin. Thank you very much for being here, Jana. And 2 more panelists are with us digitally. First of all, Major General Jörg in his civilian capacity today as Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning at NATO. So he is in charge, actually, of the topic of our panel. Where is NATO going? What does NATO have to do a good job? Welcome. And with us digitally, too, from our partner country, Lithuania, is Dr. Margarita Šešelgyte. She is the director of the Institute of International Relations and Political Science in Vilnius. Welcome, Ms. Šešelgyte. I would like to start with Tobias Lindner, German MP. So, because of and despite of Joe Biden, we Europeans and we Germans have to say where we want to go with NATO. This is an interesting question for the Green Party. The Green Party is aiming to become a governing party in the next federal elections. So what's your idea to make NATO fit for the future? Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here at the NATO talk once more. If I were able to present this one excellent blueprint solution then this event would be over and we wouldn't have anything to talk about. But I believe that it is an important question because we need a good new focus for NATO. And secondly, we want to get past this idealistic dream of everything will get better right now with the Biden administration. But we have to make a specific offer, we as Europe and as Germany, and not just explain the US what's impossible to do. Because I think the Germans like to do that. Nuclear sharing is not possible, 2%, we can't do that either, we can't do this, we can't do that. So what can we do? And there are three important issues. The title of this panel is Naturally Together. What does that mean, naturally? What links us naturally? We have to define that. And this means that we have to look at the internal rifts within NATO. We've mentioned Turkey. I've just heard a discussion between Kramp-Karrenbauer and Macron. You know, these are all things that we have to look at. And then another thing that Europe has to address is willingness to take responsibility in our own neighborhood. I'm talking about Eastern Europe, about the Baltics, capabilities like air defense. Of course, we need security guarantees by the US, but we also need our own capabilities. And then third point, and I think it's worth thinking about this more. So if we look at China and the Indo-Pacific, then we can see that this region will have to play a role for NATO, even if it's not traditionally part of the area that NATO looks at. Because if we agree that freedom of navigation also touches upon fundamental values, not just trade interests, then NATO has to find a common strategy for this area. It doesn't have to be a German-French aircraft carrier or an aircraft carrier group in the region, but NATO has to put these questions on the agenda and develop a common strategy for the region. And the allies have to do more and take on more of the burden. We've seen that we have a lot to talk about on this panel, but to be fair, I would like to give the floor to all of our four panelists first, and then open up the discussion for our audience. So please hand in your questions on Slido, and we will have at least half an hour to answer them. Jana Puglierin, European Council on Foreign Relations. So maybe you can take a more European point of view here. We always say that there should be a European pillar in NATO. Europeans should take more responsibility. That has been a leitmotif of today too. But Ambassador Brose said it right in the beginning. But how? We have so many small ideas, so many baby steps that may be really nice, but they're clearly not enough. They're not enough for a strategy. So what do we have to do to make Europeans more capable to act within NATO? Well, first of all, I think we need to find a consensus for this goal of a European pillar. This morning I read the interview with the French president, and NATO was mentioned only once, and he said we've always relied too much on NATO, and this had a negative impact on our independence. So it's hard to talk about the Europeans because we have very different ideas of what it means to do more. Doing more for the French really means a stronger focus on not just the EU, but Europe. They are part of a coalition of the willing. They are open to working with the British and the Norwegians. So they say whatever works in a European context if it brings us capabilities and ability to act. And for us German, taking over more responsibility means strengthening the European pillar in NATO, more than the pillar of the EU, really. Our former defense minister said become more European, but remain transatlantic. And for Eastern and Central European countries, it is obvious that NATO is the main player. There may be some support for Macron's ideas, but I think the important thing is that we as Europeans agree on what we want to do and how, and in which framework and context. What's important for me, for the European pillar in NATO, is to be aware that the Americans are turning towards Asia, and we have to have their backs. This is our task as Europe. So we contribute to territorial deterrence and defense towards Russia. So how can we replace the American presence in Europe that's doing just that, so that they have capacities to do something else? But I don't think there's consensus on that in Europe. And maybe that is precisely the point. It is so hard to reach consensus in EU. It takes forever. Then papers are being written, commissions are being formed. So wouldn't it be more sense to increase individual national defense capabilities? Or I don't think that's a contradiction. So there are two scenarios. One is the French are correct and the Americans are on their way out. So this means they won't be there long term and we have to do more. I believe that NATO is a format that is established, that is working, that has well-established structures, and this is why we should be using it. And if the other thing is true, that the Europeans and the Americans are going to cooperate in the long term, we will still have to do more because that's what the Americans expect from us. So in any case, we have to do more. Tobias Lindner mentioned Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer and President Macron having debates about strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, ability to act, you name it. What do we need for that? Well, first of all, we need capabilities that we procure together, ideally. I mean, it's almost Christmas. I have one wish. We would really decide together what we want to procure, because funds are not unlimited. So, more capabilities. I think Mr. See likes to hear that. He's in charge of planning. So, Mr. See, these were 4 difficult years under President Trump. I found it admirable that NATO always said, things are going great, we are absolutely able to fulfill our tasks and we're keeping up the status quo. But right now, we are in a situation where maybe you can go beyond the status quo, you can think about the future, can maybe repair things that need repairing. What kind of things would that be? What should the next steps for NATO be? Strategic concept, maybe?
Yeah, first, a warm welcome from Brussels and a bit of recognition of my colleague from Vilnius, and being here as a NATO official, I'm happy to stick to English. I would like to ponder quickly on your initial statement saying at least partially responsible for things. As you know, we have a couple of more divisions here, so I'm representing really defense planning and politics, which is at the core of NATO. And let me start with your title, the question naturally together. And actually, I here from the engine room in Brussels. And I'd say, of course, building unity and cohesion on a day-to-day basis in an alliance with 13 nations is really difficult, and sometimes more difficult than what we have seen in the last years, again and again, the case. But I think once we have reached a consensus, and then being translated into cohesive action based on the common values we share, it becomes even more powerful. As I said, hard work every day, and yes, with a big portion of, I would call it, optimism. My second point is on deterrence and defense in particular, and you just alluded to the issue of having capabilities. I think we have seen NATO in very different, let's say, ages, decades, in a constant process of review and adaptation. If you want to pack it into the time NATO until 1990, very much dedicated to collective defense, having another more than two decades of NATO coping with crisis management primarily. And now we are back NATO since 2014, definitely into a more collective defense focus on that. But this is not the same as we had seen before. This is even much complex. And I think many panelists alluded to that today already in the world of emerging disruptive technology, of COVID, of hybrid. What does it mean to us? Actually, the lines between peacetime and conflict are more or less blurring now. So it's more complicated and complex as it has been before. Where should we go? And I'm not rattling through the NATO agenda. I think this might lead a bit too far, but I'll just try to put on a couple of, let's say, buzzwords, and you might come back in the further discussion. I think, firstly, the mindset has to change. What we have seen between 1990 and beginning of 2000s was actually having operations of choice, not of necessity. It was a deliberate decision to embark upon an operation activity or whatever. This has changed. And over the years, we developed a couple of parameters talking on being more responsive, able to, with ready forces, having the proper reinforcements. And I think this is what that has been already started heavily since 2014. Translated into more easy language, we need the proper plans, we need the right forces, the right capabilities, and of course the control structure, command and control structure that is required. And we also need the nuclear umbrella, and I'm happy to come back to that later, even though it's a difficult one, I know. And I would like to introduce the word of resilience in here, and I think especially the COVID pandemic, but even our surrounding of hybrid threats made it very clear this resilience piece, which is in the DNA, I would say, of NATO, becomes more and more evident, and I'm happy to explain further what it means. Lastly, on spending, and I think was heavily alluded to in different panels. I had the privilege to sit in Wales just as a backseater in Wales in the room when we self-committed, and I recall what Ambassador Gordon said, to 2% and, by the way, to 20%. So it's very obvious. It's a self-commitment. And more practical, I would say, the investments from today translate into our capability for tomorrow. It's not a question to spend money for the sake of spending money, really translating, transforming into tangible capabilities in order to get this long list of tasks done. NATO 2030 is a different one. I'm happy to come back to that later as well. But it's not only making NATO politically stronger, also militarily stronger. So just continue the way and the path we have already embarked upon. And of course, going global. This is not only the question of China. This is also how we get on with our partners and where we do that. So, as you said, a long list of things we have to do, and we do it in a very, let's say, decisive way and very optimistic.
Thank you very much, Mr. See. That was a great tour d'horizon. We did not have perfect audio, but I hope that our audience was able to hear you well. And I'm sure we get back to a few of your points, but last but not least, I have a question for Dr. Šešelgyte.
When I speak to my colleagues in the east of the alliance, in Poland and Lithuania and Latvia, wherever, what I usually hear is a lot of happiness with and satisfaction with the performance of NATO in recent years. The deterrence initiative is being praised usually, and so my question for you is, if you look towards the future steps for NATO, what is your recommendation? Do we need more of the same, more of a presence at the eastern flank, or do you think, with your perspective from Vilnius, that we need to focus more on other things? For example, the southern flank of NATO. Maybe we have to prepare more for hybrid threats and challenges, or, as we've heard today multiple times, do we have to tackle China more as a challenge? What are the priorities for the future for NATO?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for giving me a floor, and thanks the organizers for inviting me to speak for such an honorable audience on very important issue for us, in particular in the Eastern and Central Europe. And indeed, we are very happy with the enhanced forward presence initiative in Lithuania, and special thanks goes to Germany. And I believe that's how NATO is working. On one hand, we are receiving the military presence from Germany, but Germany just recently has become, in the eyes of Lithuanian society, the security partner #1. Lithuanian society believe that Germany is the most important partner for our security. So I think it is a military alliance, but also a political alliance. And if there is more interconnectedness, there is better for NATO, there are stronger links. So that's what I would like to emphasize. On one hand, I would like to focus what could be done in our area. But on the other hand, I want to remind that NATO is an entity, as a unity. And what happens for NATO as an entity, it is also important for our region. So in terms of our region, I would say that those initiatives which have been started after the crisis in Ukraine started is a very good beginning, but it has to continue. On one hand, we need more presence, NATO presence on the soil, on the permanent basis. We need the US presence on the soil. Because, I noted how Jana was emphasizing the importance of US presence for NATO, but it is particularly important for our region because due to the very big military imbalance on the ground, there is a strong belief that only the US presence in the region could effectively deter Russia and could effectively defend us from Russia, both politically and also militarily. So for us, US presence is of particular importance in the region. Another important issue is also military mobility, because due to various challenges on the ground, like A2AD bubble and the outdated infrastructure, not prepared infrastructure, there is a fear that if something happens, NATO forces would not be able to reinforce those forces which are present now on the ground. So military mobility, both legal, procedural, but also infrastructural, is very important, and it should continue. Unfortunately, the budget for military mobility was slashed on the EU side a lot. And I think that that's a very bad news, but we are hoping that it still continues. Also, those countries, we expect that our governments, but also the governments of our neighbors would continue investing in our own defense, because it's also very important, you know, while we are waiting for NATO reinforcements, we have to withstand the threats ourselves. So this is about the conventional thing, and NATO is viewed as the organization who is ensuring through the collective defense, the defense against the conventional threat. But there is another very important part, is hybrid threats. And as majority of the states in this region, in Central and Eastern Europe, are small to medium-sized countries, sometimes hybrid activities from the bigger opponent might impose a big challenge for us because we lack administrative resources, defense resources, and we need a shelter also to protect ourselves from these threats. And here NATO is not very well prepared, neither legally, nor procedurally, nor in terms of capabilities. Therefore, one road for NATO could be more cooperation with the, for instance, European Union in this area, more cooperation with NGOs, with business, with the local governments to create a certain net of the capabilities and to ensure certain legal procedures. What happens if there is a situation where one country faces a very serious hybrid attack, like, for instance, Estonia was facing in 2007 and is not capable dealing with this threat on its own. But apart from the problems, challenges that we're facing in the region, I think that there are two other things that NATO has to focus, not to lose its relevance and strategic advance. One is investment in technologies. And here you have mentioned China, but also Russia. Both countries are investing in modernization of their armed forces, in the new technologies, like disruptive technologies. And there could be some game changers that would pose a very big challenge to NATO if we do not focus on what's happening and if we do not invest in these technologies and defense against these technologies. And last but not least, this also issue has been already brought up today. It's the NATO being a community of values. And I think it's very important to remember this, because what I'm seeing now, there are more and more tensions between the democracies and autocracies. And democratic values have to be defended in our region, but not only in our region, also in the other regions. And NATO is the organization who has this role and mission, because it's stated in NATO's preamble that NATO members have to defend rule of law and other values of the democracies. So more attention also has to be put on the defense of the democratic values, on one hand within NATO, and on the other hand, cooperating with other democracies, non-NATO members, to defend the values outside NATO. So I think that these areas where NATO has to focus in order to ensure security in our region, but also to be relevant and efficient in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Šešelgyte. I would like to pass over one aspect that you mentioned, Mr. See. You said that NATO is not sufficiently prepared for hybrid conflicts. That ties in nicely with a question that we received on Slido, where Jonas Schmidt from BSH is asking, how can a comprehensive approach to strengthen resilience of NATO, but what can this look like? Mr. See, please enlighten us. What is NATO doing in that regard?
I'm not sure whether I can enlighten you entirely, but I would like to start with the word of resilience, because resilience, as I said, is in the DNA of NATO. And I think over the last years, a lot of things have been started doing in terms of that. And the security of critical sectors like energy, transport, communications, and thereby 5G is only one piece, and new and emerging technologies have been translated into what we call 7 baseline requirements. The interesting piece is now, when we start talking to each other, this is not only just something for the ministries of defense. This is in all of our nations totally differently organized. So we have to talk to the ministries of interior, transport, infrastructure. And then we depend on nations, let's say, first and foremost, willingness to share the information. And the baselines, if you like, function as a kind of a benchmark in order to measure in each of the countries where we are on that. This is an evolving process, and to, let's say, to further build this resilience even stronger, especially on this regard, is definitely something that becomes more and more important on our way to a possible next summit or leaders meeting next year, because the pandemic revealed quite heavily that many of these gaps and lacks we have in there have already been existing before, but they just underlined the need to do that. And hybrid and cyber is part of it. Lies very often in national responsibility, but NATO can clearly function as a forum to discuss that with the different stakeholders, not only on the military side, but also on the civil side and also in the societal aspects. And I think our Scandinavian neighbors have some quite good approaches on how to do that, what they call the, let's say, overall societal approach to that and whole of government approach, how to do that. We are about, I think, for mid of next year to finish our work, not in our division, on a new cyber and hybrid policy elements, which also will strengthen that. And I'm happy that my Lithuanian colleague raised that. This is definitely one of the areas where we could do more. However, the more we get into the resilience piece, the more the national piece comes into a prominent role. And as I said, we will try to be the more and more better facilitator for that. And this could be maybe the aim point. As you know, in the military world, we have a NATO planning process, within which we try to keep nations more or less accountable to clear targets and clear delivery on targets. This could be also an idea to do it on the resilience side, because it's part of it. It's not something that is isolated from our deterrence and defense. It's actually depending on it. Having no resilient societies, having no resilient structures, then our deterrence and defense has a clear challenge, and this is what we're working upon.
Thank you.
Another aspect that Mrs. Šešelgyte brought up, Jana, was that it is important for the allies in the East that the Americans remain present on the European continent. In your introductory remarks, Jana, you said that a future deal between the EU and the US could look as such. The Europeans, with the Germans leading the way, invest more and take over the conventional defense of Europe, and so that the Americans are free for their commitment in the Indo-Pacific region. So how does that work with a president who thinks Eastern Europe is important? Well, it must not be either or. Let's say Joe Biden will review the troop reduction that Donald Trump announced and will reverse it in part and maybe actually reduce 50% of what Donald Trump announced. And even under Obama we had withdrawals. Then the basic thought in the US is that there are fewer US soldiers on European soil, and we need to get used to that thought. With Donald Trump, we saw that. We can't count on Biden reversing all of this. So we need to reorganize ourselves. And of course, an American presence in these countries is extremely important. But the question is, how many American soldiers do we need? And that's a question to Margarita, maybe. So how many American soldiers do we need to make sure that the two strategic areas don't drift apart, but to instead make sure that we have one strategic region? So we want to prevent an American decoupling in a way. So I think we need to let go of the thought that we will see more and more soldiers here that reinforce and that are American soldiers, but that we need European soldiers. Margarita, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. How many is enough and how many is too little or too much? So there are all sorts of the recommendations coming from the different think tanks, from 7 brigades to 5 brigades. But I think, you know, it is good to have at least some. And I believe that this function that the troops on our soil is providing is sending the political message to Russia. Because the problem is that the deterrence is in its essence is a psychological concept. And we have to convince Russia that Russia doesn't want to come here and do some problems, that it would be too costly for Russia to come to the Baltic states and invoke some damage for Baltic states at the beginning, but by extension, to invoke the damage on NATO. So 1 battalion is already a good start to send a political message, because Russia is deterred only by Americans. That's the thinking that they have. It's not because of, the capacities, but these things also have to be taken into consideration. Russia is a nuclear state. So how Russia could be deterred by the other nuclear state? And I don't think that, it's the size of the US component, which is very important, but the presence, the political messaging is even more important for the deterrence.
And I believe there are components that you can't replace. For example, nuclear component. We need to think about what we as Europeans can replace and step in for and what we can't. And nuclear component, no, we can't replace that. And so that builds a bridge, a dual bridge to Tobias Lindner. And I feared that this would come. My favorite question. Let me start off softly with my question before we get to the hard stuff. If I understand you correctly in the beginning, when you talked about the presence in the Indo-Pacific, etc., you wouldn't say that a strong division of labor is the right future for NATO. So not saying that the Europeans take care of Europe and the more conventional aspects and the Americans do the Indo-Pacific. You were saying everybody needs to be able to do everything in NATO. Well, in the end, of course, not everybody needs to be able to do everything. Let's not create a contradiction where there is none. But NATO, of course, and I'm an economist, is a kind of an insurance. Article 5 is an insurance policy, if you will. Of course, it must be clear that this mechanism is valid. I cannot separate and share the burden here, but when talking about capabilities or planning processes, I can, of course, divide up the labor and the tasks. Look to the Baltics, for example. You heard about military mobility. In Germany, we talk a lot about the planned Defender 2020, which wasn't conducted, this exercise, but we discussed it a lot. But let's be honest, only the United States within NATO are capable to provide the number of troops and to deploy them. And when we talk about division of labor, Europe, if it really wanted to provide a security guarantee for the Eastern partners, it would have to work on that. It can't be the case that Germany is responsible for the VJTF year by year, and I fear also for 2023 that the Bundeswehr has to go look for functioning material to provide the VJTF. That's not realistic. It's just one unit, but it's a unit that is not overly large, and that's what I meant. This is where we need to do our homework in Europe. The need of that is very clear for me. The nuclear questions are not easy, and we have to address them, of course. Let's talk about the nuclear questions then. Joschka Fischer has been tortured with that just before. You saw it, and I'll ask somebody who's still politically responsible, maybe even more so in the future than now. I'll hide behind Christoph, somebody asking online. Christoph says, if the Green Party is going to be the party who's going to decide who is to become the chancellor, would you accept nuclear sharing and then take on government responsibility? Well, people love this question. I face it all the time. So people ask me, is that a red line? And no matter what my red line would be in whatever field of politics, and I would discuss that a year before election, that would just bode badly for my party's election. I've never met anybody who really likes nuclear weapons, and I always want to work for and strive for a world without nuclear weapons, and that concerns all nuclear states, and that's the first part of my response. But I expect from NATO that it exerts political pressure on Russia, and then you can discuss what is a prerequisite for that pressure, so that in Europe we can reduce the number of tactical nuclear weapons. What happened last year was this: the INF Treaty died. That was not good news. And then in nuclear sharing, for me, there is not just black or white. No. Black being everything stays the way it is and we'll never talk about it again and let's just deal with nuclear sharing, and white would be the other extreme. Let's say Rolf Mützenich would be in my way and in my place and say Germany will leave the nuclear sharing team and will never talk about it again and will not talk to our partners and will tell the Americans just take your nuclear bombs and leave. So I believe that between these two extremes there is a lot of gray area. The federal parliament had a vote a few years back when we voted on this and where we decided that we no longer need nuclear sharing, but in 2020 the majority of the parliamentarians says it's different, we do need it. I would like to work towards the goal that in 2030 or 2035 in a Russia without President Putin we get another window of opportunity where you could maybe come to a situation where we reduce nuclear weapons, and that's what I mean by gray area. I think this is something that we need to discuss, and I think it's not wise to define absolute red lines in whatever field of politics.
So, nuclear sharing is, we can discuss the nuclear strategy, but also the transatlantic relations as a whole and many of the elements that we've mentioned. Many say it's very important to keep the US in Europe, and so nuclear sharing would be an excellent occasion for buying very, very modern, state-of-the-art nuclear-capable airplanes from the US. And others would say we would like... Excuse me, there seem to be technical difficulties. So the compromise the Chancellor offered is that the golden middle. Well, I think I can make things easy for myself. If you look at the military aviation strategy of the federal government, this is certainly not a basic document of the Green Party, but anyway, the fundamental principle is that the German Air Force should always have two kinds of combat aircraft. So replacing this aging Tornado aircraft and not by Eurofighters, 100% of Eurofighters, because in the end you would have an Air Force that only has Eurofighters. And, you know, we've always had cases that right in the end of manufacture, we saw that there was this little issue at the wing of the aircraft, and this is why, and then all German Eurofighters would have to stay on the ground, and that is not a good strategy. So, F-18 and the specific numbers of aircraft, we can discuss all that, but I think it is out of the question that even because of only because of risk reduction and some sort of independence, you should have two different kinds of aircraft in an air force, nuclear sharing or not. And I believe that this has always been a guiding principle in the German Air Force, and it's not going to change. Okay, great. So one more question from our audience. So we are looking towards the future on this panel. And the future is full of surprises. And this is why we are discussing strategic foresight, for example. I know that we are currently building a new Center for Strategic Foresight at the Federal Academy for Security Policy, and Matthias Gödeking, who participated in our NATO's Future seminar. And it's a question to Mr. Z.
This weekend, we discussed the importance of foresight to avoid strategic surprises. Which assumptions need to be questioned more in order to remain prepared? Herr See, was sagt Ihr Team B? Welche Annahmen, die wir haben?
So what does your team say? Which assumptions do we have to question?
Right away. Actually, I have 2 points on other areas, but maybe we have not the time for that.
Well, go ahead. Do both.
I'm glad for this weekend question because strategic foresight is definitely something we would definitely need. And as you know, we have one strategic command across the Atlantic, the command looking, let's say, more to in the future, currently working on a concept, on a, let's say, far-reaching out document until 2040 in terms of getting exactly these kind of answers. How does it look like in the future? What can we expect? So this is more or less, I would say, the think piece on that. What is then also important is to translate, let's say, the think piece, the result of that, into, let's say, tangible action, like capability development or whatsoever. So to find the right path from looking outside, what are the assumptions, what do we need, and how would you translate it? Because translated into capabilities means clearly we are back again into the question of defense spending and so forth. We have also other means in NATO we are just developing now, one of which is called net assessment, which also looks into the future and the current situation, tries to draw conclusions on that. And then again, it is the question how to translate it into proper action within our processes and procedures. So far, I think this question, which was discussed yesterday, also our division was involved there, talking about space and other issues, I think is one of the most relevant. But thinking is one piece, but then make it, let's say, affordable and manageable into clear and tangible action. This is also relevant.
You had two more points that you wanted to
I'll try to be as brief as I can.
elaborate
on.
on.
One was on presence, forward, and so forth. I just try to quickly explain a bit of the mechanics you need. I spoke about the 3 R's. The one is responsiveness. You can translate it with based upon solid information, intelligence, to be able to take a rapid decision when required at the speed of relevance. The first step. The second one are the ready forces, and the whole issue of having forward forces on the one side, and then with ready forces creating reinforcements, the third R, is currently the strategy and the plans we are working upon. And especially Mr. Lindner, he said it very clearly. Reinforcements based on enablement, mobility, again, resilience. In easy words, we have to make sure that reinforcements, wherever they come from, even from the US across the Atlantic, are properly, let's say, received in mainland Europe, and then making sure that they have to be very rapidly available somewhere, either in the east, in the south, or in the north. Because the military concept clearly covers 360 degrees and not only one direction. My second remark goes to the nuclear side. As you know, in the NATO strategy, apart from the conventional side, the nuclear side is an integral part of it. And I'm totally with also Mr. Lindner on that, saying NATO has a clear goal, having ideally a world without nuclear weapons, but the conditions are not being yet met. And a world in which Russia or China or North Korea, have other nuclear weapons and NATO has none or less would not be safer. And he alluded to Russia as well. Of course, we have a dual-track strategy, credible deterrence and defense, including the nuclear side as well, and dialogue. So for this kind of nuclear deterrence, and now the German audience maybe not like it, but relies on appropriate capabilities, back to the platforms, the resolve to use it, or at least to train and exercise it, and to effectively communicate it. Otherwise, if it's something totally secret and nobody knows it, I think it's not a matter of deterrent. And the NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements are clearly part of it. And the broad participation of many nations in that clearly also show, let's say, their resolve to share the risks and responsibilities, also part of the NATO's nuclear deterrence, and not possible without your support on that. When it comes to that, we need that kind of US umbrella. And I think also Ambassador Dolder, not today, I saw an essay written by him last week. He was also very clear on that. And from a NATO perspective, it's an integral part of our strategy. And the platform, just maybe as a German general on that, this is heavily related to industry and so forth. In the end of the day, we in NATO have to make sure that the quality is there. Whether it's called an F-18, F-1, whatsoever, we need the quality. What we cannot afford is stepping down, decreasing our quality to maintain our nuclear forces. This is what not going. This must not happen. The rest is a question of what is the right platform, what is the right mix, and how do we integrate other thoughts on that.
Vielen Dank, Herr See. Das hatte fast schon die Qualität eines Schlussstatements.
Thank you very much. That was almost a closing statement, but we're not quite there yet. I have a question to Dr. Šešelgyte. I would like to get back to strategic foresight and how to avoid surprises. You talk a lot about how it forms or think about forming strategies, foreign policy research, which are assumptions that we have within NATO that we take for granted, but that we should question for our next strategic steps.
Thank you. That's a very challenging question indeed. I think that, you know, this year was a very good illustration how things are suddenly changing our mindset and our ways of life. And we have never thought that they could be changed to that extent. And even at NATO level, the pandemic, although it didn't disrupt the functioning of NATO, but was causing certain challenges in terms of the supply chain, in terms of the personnel being sick and infected by COVID, and also the ability to move probably so easily. So things are, the life is full of unknowns. So it's very difficult to answer this question. But I think that there are certain trends that have to be followed. And on one thing, which is very important, is the increasing tension between the democracies and autocracies. And this will not go away. And we have to be prepared to this. And we have to be prepared that it's going to be grabbing our attention, both in Europe and also in the United States. So there will be more probably spots where our attention has to go. So what does it mean for us? It means we have to prepare, but on the other hand, we need to cooperate more with other democracies. That's one of the strategies that we have to take to share to divide the labor, not only among NATO countries, but also the other like-minded countries, the old democracies like Japan or New Zealand or Australia, but also the new democracies, our Eastern partners like Georgia and Ukraine. Those countries also could be the part of the process. Another very important aspect is the technological change, and the technological changes are happening exponentially. It's happening very rapidly, and this is going to have a major impact on NATO. One day we believe that we have enough of forces, of capabilities, and then they are able to deter our enemies, our opponents. But one day there could be some, innovation that could change the strategic balance. So this is also a very important thing to look. And the last but not least, the unity within the alliance. I think that at some point, during the last years, there was a lot of damage inflicted by the certain messages, not probably the diverging interest, because we still, within the NATO, we have the main interest to defend ourselves against the external threats. But the messages which were going both outside NATO, externally, and also internally, NATO obsolete or NATO is brain dead, and that's very unhealthy. So I think at some point there should be some time given for the trust, to rebuild trust among the partners, to not be afraid to raise very tough questions, because there are some questions and there are some disagreements because of those questions were not answered. But unless these questions are being raised and discussed, I don't think that NATO would be able to move forward as a unity and would be able to give something also for the other democracies which are looking at the NATO countries as a role model. So keep an eye on the integrity inside NATO and bring up the tough questions which have to be answered. So I think that these three things that has to be taken care of.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. So NATO cohesion is something we've been talking about all day. And looking at the questions we received for this panel, they are very similar to the questions we've heard before. I don't know if it is because of how impressive the Turkish ambassador was here today, but many of these questions are about Turkey. And this is why I have this question from the audience to all our panelists. Jana Puglierin, the #1 question is, how should NATO deal with Turkey in future, and which options are there? Well, before I answer that, I would like to say one more thing about division of labor. Don't get me wrong. I don't believe that we Europeans should focus on deterrence vis-à-vis Russia. Of course, we also have to look towards the south, engage in crisis management, and also focus on freedom of navigation, because that is in our interest. I just don't think that Europe will be massively engaged in Asia. We can't really communicate that to our public. Then capability planning is important too. We are already overwhelmed by what we have to do. I am convinced that over time we will have to replace the work of the US troops here. But to be able to do that, we also need to prioritize what's most important to us Europeans at the moment. And I believe it's not Asia and it's not the defense of Taiwan, but it is deterrence towards Russia, and is crisis management in the south, and it is reassurance of our allies. And if we manage all of that, then the Americans would be very happy and say, well, that's something, isn't it? So let's get back to the question of Turkey. I have a very realist point of view here rather than value-oriented. I believe that having Turkey as part of NATO, in spite of all the issues, is the best solution that we have. We could use, and we have been able to use, NATO to keep up the dialogue when we had the issues in the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, and it is also a means to exert pressure. For me, Turkey is a strategic stakeholder in the region, and I hope that under President Biden there will be stronger pressure on Turkey, because this alliance between Trump and Erdogan will no longer be there. So I believe it is important to set some limits for Turkey, but sidelining it would be strategically not a good option. So Jana Puglierin called it realistic and not value-based. Well, I would like to be value-based here. Well, first of all, of course, Turkey is a problem for NATO at the moment. If you get an S-400 air defense system, then you may threaten the security of your allies, because the data may go to Russia, and that is a problem we have. But, you know, NATO, we always have good answers for what we do when we have external problems, but we don't know what to do with our internal problems. There's nothing on that in the NATO treaties. So all I can say is we have to talk, we have to exert pressure, and, you know, we have to let Turkey know that certain things are just not an option. That's the best answer I have. I think the more interesting question is, what will Turkey after Erdogan look like, and when will that be? And how do we know whether it will start sooner or later? Which factors are responsible for that? And what influence do we have on Turkey? What can we do to exert pressure? Well, one example, of course, Turkey expects NATO to do air surveillance with the AWACS systems, always also over Turkey. And of course, Turkey should be aware that an S-400 and an AWACS system in the same airspace, that's not going to work. So Turkey as a difficult ally, what do you think about that, Mr. Z?
Turkey is an ally. Turkey is a valuable ally, full stop. And it was just said for geostrategic reasons and for many other reasons as well. The second one, what I said in the beginning, daily work, cohesion is not easy to achieve. But once achieved, it's absolutely relevant. And I must say, without Turkey, I think we would be even in a more difficult situation as NATO as a whole. Number three, I think the Secretary General tried very heavily to support that and also to help. I'm just thinking about these deconfliction mechanisms on sea in the maritime world, just to help and to support, which is, by the way, not the first time. Even historically, I would say in '96, we have had these incidents between Turkey and Greece, and NATO played a bit of a moderation role. But I'm just saying it's not the first time. NATO 2030 might find the answer, hopefully. As we said, strong militarily, stronger politically, more global. The Turkey issue with Turkey definitely needs to be addressed, if not even solved in there. And I would like to conclude on that, also to sometimes really understand where the problem is. If you talk about procurement and things like that, and the relation to the EU, and from a Turkish perspective, when I chair the capability pieces, if they cannot work together with the EU partners, or with the EU, or sometimes even not with the NATO, then we more or less push them into another direction, maybe even into a direction where we don't want them. So in the end of the day, we need to find a solution for that, which is not an easy one on a daily basis. Sorry.
Margarita Šešelgyte,
Margarita Šešelgyte, this issue of Turkey also touches upon NATO-EU cooperation, and if we don't achieve better coordination between these two organizations, then we can't really discuss the future of NATO. How can we overcome the known obstacles to get to a better and more efficient cooperation?
Yeah, that's sort of a schizophrenic situation, because the majority of the member states are the member states of both organizations, and yet the cooperation is not so easy to achieve. But I think that, you know, there are some certain moves towards the right direction, and these moves have been taken since 2016. And there are a number of areas that both organizations are cooperating, and in particular in creating the capacities, necessary capabilities to respond to the hybrid threats. And military mobility was one of the major projects that was supported by both organizations. And this is a very good example how both of them could move forward. One of the major challenges for the cooperation, apart from the Greek-Turkish Cyprus issue, which is have been also not challenging this cooperation on the lower level, on the project level, was the US-European relations, which were a bit tense over the last years. So I have a hope that since the new administration in the United States come to power, there will be more consultation and negotiation when it comes to the better cooperation, transatlantic cooperation, maybe even coming back to the TTIP agreement, which would be also a potential solution of one of the challenges within the EU, like a PESCO issue, an EDF issue, the ability to finance non-European Union state projects, companies. So I think that we are moving towards a good direction, and the area of the joint work on the creation of capabilities meant to address the hybrid threats is a very good area to start cooperating, but certain issues have to be addressed, and one of the most important issues is the transatlantic relations. And also there is this second issue, which is a historical issue of Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey. And on one hand, I don't see the very fast solution on this issue, but that's why I said, you know, things have to be talked about. The very difficult questions have to be raised. And then if they answer, there is more cohesion and more potential for cooperation.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. We have time for one last short round of statements. Imagine next spring the new American President Joe Biden will visit Brussels. Imagine it's his first visit to NATO together with all heads of state and government. And then after that there is a press conference with statements. Every one of you can now pick one concrete measure that you hope will be announced or declared that way. Ms. Šešelgyte, what would be your headline?
Well, that's a very difficult question, but you know, since I'm coming from Central and Eastern European states, so while representing this region, so I would say the U.S. presence on the ground would be a very good statement for us.
Thank you. Herr See.
Mr. See, your press statement, you can have it printed now.
I think it's the best way to just to clearly tell them that NATO is really, I would call it the embodiment of the transatlantic bond between Europe and North America. And US leadership is as important as ever. And I would add, a strong Europe is also good for North America and NATO. And Ambassador Dolde called it the two-way street, and I would highlight that in the first statement.
Vielen Dank. Jana Puglierin.
Thank you, Jana Puglierin. I don't know if it's necessary, but after 4 years of Trump, it is indeed necessary. I would get a confirmation, I would want a confirmation from the Americans that they still support Article 5. That is what I would love to see, and that they want a new concept, a new strategic concept, and that they want to move ahead with that. That's what I would want. Tobias Lindner. Once Article 5 is confirmed, we want Joe Biden to say that he specifies more clearly what dialogue means, actually, and how dialogue is being translated and implemented vis-à-vis Russia, and whether there's going to be some kind of a treaty at some point. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of those who were on the panel with me, to those who are present here, and those who joined us online. Thank you very much for your attention, your questions. I thank the interpreters who've been working with us and doing a great job all day today. I thank everybody who organized and put the NATO talk together. We're not yet done, though. We will get final remarks in a few minutes, but I will now hand over to Julia Weigelt. Thank you very much for your attention.